January 17, 1945. Leyte Gulf, Philippine Islands. The air tasted of salt and diesel smoke. Along the grey steel deck of the USS Cascade, a repair ship anchored in waters still stained by the ghost of recent battle, American sailors moved with the methodical rhythm of men who had grown accustomed to the strange geometry of war. The sun hung low and merciless over the Pacific, casting long shadows across metal that had seen too much. Somewhere in the ship's interior, where corridors smelled of oil and sweat and disinfectant, a door opened, and through that door walked a figure that would challenge every assumption the men aboard had carried across 10,000 miles of ocean. She was small. That was the first thing they noticed. Small in the way that seemed impossible for someone who had worn the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army. Her hair, cropped short and uneven, framed a face that bore neither defiance nor surrender, only the blank exhaustion of someone who had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The dress she wore was military issue, drab and shapeless, but it hung on her frame like a costume from some theater of the absurd. When she stumbled slightly on the raised lip of the doorframe, a young common reached out instinctively to steady her. His hand touched fabric, and in that touch, something tore. Not the dress itself, not yet, but something else. Some invisible membrane that had separated myth from reality, propaganda from truth, because the woman standing before these American sailors was not supposed to exist. In the carefully constructed narrative of total war, there were no such things as Japanese women soldiers. The enemy was monolithic, fanatical, male. The enemy died screaming banzai on distant beaches or crashed burning into carrier decks in aircraft laden with explosives and prayer. The enemy did not stand 5 feet tall, wear a torn dress, and look at you with eyes that had somehow managed to retain their humanity despite everything. The war had tried to take. What happened next in that cramped corridor of the USS Cascade would become the subject of whispered conversations, official reports filed and quietly buried, and decades later, historical examination. A US soldier, his name preserved in some documents, erased from others, reached out and tore the dress the woman wore. Not violently, not with the intention that later retellings would sometimes suggest, but deliberately, methodically, as though searching for something that logic insisted must be there, but that his eyes refused to confirm. He was looking for weapons. That was what the report would later say. Standard procedure for processing enemy prisoners of war. But the truth that circulated in quieter spaces, in the journals of Navy doctors and the private letters of men who witnessed what followed, was far more complex and far more troubling. He was looking for proof. Proof that what stood before him was real. Proof that the Empire of Japan, in its final desperate convulsions, had crossed a line that even total war had previously respected. Proof that the woman they had captured was not an aberration, not a spy or a civilian caught in military clothing, but something that shattered the careful categories by which men try to make sense of mass slaughter. She did not resist. That detail would appear in every account that survived. As the fabric tore, revealing the crude bindings beneath cloth wrapped tight to flatten, to disguise, to transform, she simply stood with the same blank exhaustion that had marked her face from the moment she emerged into American custody. And in her stillness, she became a mirror that reflected back at the Americans gathered around her all the assumptions they had carried into this war, all the certainties that had sustained them 3 years of killing and dying, all the propaganda that had painted their enemy as something less than human and therefore easier to fight. But mirrors can lie. Or rather, mirrors show only what stands before them. And what stood before these American sailors in January 1945 was not the complete truth of Japan's final mobilization, but a single fracture point in a much larger story. A story that had begun not in the desperate final months of the war, but years earlier, in the carefully planned transformation of an entire society into a weapon. To understand the torn dress, one must first understand the arithmetic of annihilation. By late 1944, Imperial Japan faced a mathematical certainty that no amount of spiritual fortitude could alter. The combined fleet lay scattered across the floor of the Pacific, its carriers and battleships transformed into artificial reefs where fish now schooled through spaces where men had once walked. The Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Carolines, each defensive perimeter had crumbled under the weight of American material superiority. B-29 superfortresses now flew from bases in the Marianas, carrying tons of incendiary death to cities built of paper and wood. The Philippines, once the centerpiece of Japan's southern empire, was being systematically reclaimed by MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. The numbers told a story that the Imperial General Staff could read, but could not speak aloud. Japan had lost 3.5 million tons of merchant shipping. Oil imports had dropped to 15% of 1941 levels. Aircraft production, despite heroic efforts to disperse factories into caves and rural areas, could not replace the trained pilots lost in the meat grinder of attrition warfare. The army that had marched triumphantly into Nanking, Manila, Singapore that had planted the rising sun flag across a third of the Earth's surface was now bleeding from 1,000 wounds it could neither cauterize nor ignore. In this context, the mobilization of women into direct combat roles was not progressive. It was not even pragmatic in the conventional sense. It was symptomatic of a society that had chosen collective death over conditional surrender. The Annotation Tie, the Women's Volunteer Corps, had existed since 1944, initially organized for labor and civil defense. Women assembled munitions, grew food, dug tank traps, trained with bamboo spears against the invasion they knew was coming. But on Leyte, in the Philippines, something had evolved beyond these defensive preparations. Women had been integrated into active military units, given uniforms, given weapons, and sent to hold positions against an enemy whose industrial capacity could bury entire divisions under artillery fire without noticing the expenditure. The woman who stood aboard the USS Cascade had been part of this final mobilization. Documents recovered later would identify her unit, a mixed auxiliary battalion attached to the 16th Division, tasked with defending supply lines in the mountainous interior of Leyte. They had fought not in the grand set-piece battles that made history books, but in the grinding, unglamorous combat of ambush and retreat, of positions held until they became untenable, of supply caches defended with rifle fire until American firepower rendered defense meaningless. Most of her unit had died, not in glorious charges, but in the slow attrition of cut supply lines, disease, and the systematic destruction of any position that showed resistance. She had survived by surrendering. That simple fact marked her as extraordinary, because surrender was the one transgression that the Code of Bushido, as interpreted by the Imperial Army, could not forgive. To be captured was to cease being Japanese. To live as a prisoner was to choose personal shame over national honor. The propaganda that every soldier carried into battle was explicit. Death was preferable to capture, because capture meant not just personal disgrace, but disgrace to family, ancestors, the emperor himself. The expectation was suicide. If suicide proved impossible, then fighting until killed. If even that proved impossible, then finding any available means: grenade, rifle shot, cliff edge to avoid the unthinkable humiliation of enemy hands. Yet here she stood, and the Americans who processed her could not reconcile this reality with the enemy they thought they knew. The soldier who tore the dress, let us call him Corporal James Morrison, though that name appears in some documents and not others, had enlisted in 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. He had carried with him into war the righteous anger of a violated nation, the certainty that came from knowing your cause was just because the alternative was enslavement. He had trained in California, shipped out to Australia, fought his way through New Guinea where the jungle killed as efficiently as enemy bullets. He had learned to sleep in mud, to eat cold rations without tasting them, to watch friends die and then forget their faces because remembering was a luxury that survival could not afford. He had also learned to hate. Not the hot, personal hatred of individual grudge, but the cold, categorical hatred of an enemy that propaganda had carefully dehumanized. The Japanese were vermin. The Japanese were fanatics. The Japanese would fight to the last man, woman, and child because their culture was fundamentally alien, fundamentally other. This hatred was not accidental. It was policy. From orientation films to unit newspapers to the casual vocabulary of battlefield communication, the message was consistent. The enemy you face is not fully human, and therefore the violence you commit is not murder, but extermination. Morrison had believed this. He had needed to believe it, because belief made killing possible, made survival something other than an extended moral crisis. He had seen the bodies of Japanese soldiers who had fought to death rather than surrender, seen the evidence of atrocities in recaptured villages, heard the stories, some true, some exaggerated, all useful, of Japanese barbarism. The war he fought was not between nations, but between civilizations, between enlightenment and savagery. And then he stood in a corridor of the USS Cascade and watched a Japanese soldier cry, not sob, not wail, just the silent tears that come when the body finally acknowledges what the mind has been denying. The woman whose dress he had torn, whose bindings he had exposed, whose deception he had uncovered, did not rage or resist or spit defiance. She simply wept. Wept with the exhaustion of someone who had carried an impossible burden for too long, who had pretended to be something she was not because her nation demanded it, who had survived when honor dictated death, and who now stood exposed in the most literal sense before men who did not know whether to see her as enemy combatant, prisoner of war, or something for which their categories had no name. Morris would write in a letter home, a letter that his family would preserve but never discuss, that in that moment he understood nothing. The war had made sense before. It had been terrible and brutal and ugly, but it had made sense. There were sides. There were reasons. There was an enemy you could hate cleanly because that enemy existed in opposition to everything you valued. But now, holding torn fabric in his hands, watching tears track down a face that belonged to someone barely older than his sister back in Iowa, the sense drained away like water through cupped fingers. The corpsman who had first steadied her took her arm again, gently this time, and led her toward the medical bay. Morrison stood in the corridor as other sailors passed, some curious, some deliberately incurious, all of them carrying their own unpassable reactions to what they had witnessed. He stood there holding torn fabric and confronting a question that the war had never prepared him to answer. If the enemy could be this, could be her, could be someone who cried silent tears and surrendered rather than died, if the enemy was not the monolithic other that propaganda required, then what exactly had they all been doing for the past 3 years? The history of women in Imperial Japan's military mobilization is one written in euphemism and erasure. Official records are sparse, deliberately so. The ideology of the Greater East Asia Sea prosperity sphere had no comfortable place for women warriors. Women were to be mothers of the race, guardians of traditional virtue, living embodiments of Yamato Nadeshiko, the idealized Japanese femininity that combined beauty, grace, and absolute subservience. That same women would be handed rifles and sent to die defending supply dumps on Leyte Island contradicted every propaganda narrative about Japanese moral superiority, yet necessity has a way of overriding ideology. By 1944, Japan's manpower crisis was absolute. The army had expanded from 1.7 million men in 1941 to over 5 million by 1944, while simultaneously bleeding veterans into graves across the Pacific. Replacements were undertrained teenagers and men in their 40s. Farmers and shopkeepers handed rifles and told to die for the emperor. The quality of Japanese infantry declined month by month, a decline measured in the shrinking intervals between American offensives and Japanese collapses. The Honor Taishantai emerged from this crisis. Initially conceived as a civilian auxiliary for home defense, it evolved in certain desperate commands, in certain isolated garrisons where the old rules had ceased to apply, into something closer to actual military service. Women received basic training in rifle operation, grenade use, first aid. They wore uniforms, followed military discipline, and in some documented cases, engaged in direct combat. The numbers are uncertain because the records were intentionally obscured. But post-war interviews with both Japanese survivors and American forces suggest that thousands of women served in combat or combat-adjacent roles in the Philippines alone. Some were nurses who carried weapons and defended their aid stations. Some were communications specialists who found themselves on the front lines when front lines became meaningless categories. And some, a smaller number, but nonetheless significant, were integrated directly into infantry units, where their presence was hidden through the simple expedient of short hair, loose uniforms, and the assumption that no one would look too closely. The woman captured on Leyte, whose dress was torn to reveal the deception, had been one of these. Her actual name does not appear in American records. She was processed as prisoner #J-847-F, the F presumably added when her sex was confirmed. Japanese records, fragmentary and often destroyed in the final chaos, suggest she may have been part of the Takeda unit, a mixed auxiliary force that fought delaying actions in Leyte Central Mountains through late 1944 and early 1945. The unit's fate was typical of the Philippine campaign, surrounded, starved, systematically reduced by American firepower until surrender or death became the only options. She chose surrender. In doing so, she violated the most fundamental principle of Imperial Japanese military culture, that death was preferable to captivity. The field manual issued to all Japanese soldiers was explicit. Do not suffer the shame of being taken prisoner. Die rather than sustain this stain on your honor. Officers carried the emperor's portrait into battle specifically so they could destroy it before capture, ensuring that the sacred image would not fall into enemy hands. Soldiers carried grenades reserved for suicide. Entire units, when faced with certain defeat, would stage charges designed not to achieve tactical objectives, but to ensure death. This was not bravery in the conventional sense. It was the logical outcome of a society that had weaponized shame. To be Japanese was to exist within a web of obligations to family, to ancestors, to nation, to emperor that extended beyond individual life. Death in service was not an end but a transformation, a transcendence into Yasukuni Shrine where the spirits of the honored dead resided. Capture, by contrast, was erasure. Prisoners lost their names, their identities, their existence within the social order. Families would receive notice that their son or husband or father had been killed, even if the truth was captivity, because captivity was a form of death that could not be acknowledged. Yet she surrendered. And in surrendering, she joined a tiny minority of Japanese. Prisoners of war estimates suggest fewer than 5% of Japanese combatants captured during the entire Pacific War surrendered, voluntarily rather than being taken while unconscious, wounded, or otherwise incapacitated. She made a choice that the entire weight of her culture designated as unthinkable. And that choice, as much as her sex, was what shocked the Americans who processed her. The medical examination conducted aboard the USS Cascade revealed what the torn dress had already suggested: extensive bruising around the ribs and chest from the cloth bindings worn too tight for too long, malnutrition indicating weeks of inadequate food, early-stage beroperi from vitamin deficiency, infected cuts on hands and legs, and signs of prolonged stress that the Navy doctor recorded in clinical language that nonetheless conveyed a sense of profound damage. She had been fighting, or more accurately, surviving in jungle conditions for an extended period, eating whatever could be foraged or stolen, moving constantly to evade encirclement, watching her unit dissolve casualty by casualty until survival itself became the only remaining objective. The doctor, Lieutenant Commander Richard Steinberg, filed a report that would circulate through intelligence channels and eventually reach historians decades later. In it, he noted not just the physical condition but the psychological presentation. Subject demonstrates symptoms consistent with severe combat stress. Effect flat. Minimal verbal response even through interpreter. Physical examination reveals subject is female, approximately 19 to 22 years old, height 153 centimeters, weight estimated 42 kilograms. Evidence of prolonged malnutrition and physical hardship. Subject appears to have been serving in combat capacity with IJA forces. Circumstances of capture remain unclear, but subject surrendered voluntarily to advancing US units, rather than engaging in typical Japanese resistance patterns or suicide. That final observation, though, voluntary surrender, was what troubled Steinberg most. He had processed dozens of Japanese prisoners, and nearly all shared certain characteristics. They were wounded, unconscious, or so disoriented by combat that they had been captured before they could take their own lives. They rarely spoke, refused food, and often attempted suicide in captivity. The propaganda that portrayed them as fanatical was not entirely wrong. It was simply incomplete. What Americans interpreted as fanaticism was the logical endpoint of a culture that had made honor dependent on death. But this woman prisoner, J-847F, had walked into American lines with her hands raised. She had chosen captivity over death, and that choice suggested something that intelligence officers found far more troubling than fanaticism. It suggested that the totality of Japanese commitment, the wall of cultural certainty that made every defensive position into a killing ground, might not be as total as believed. If one Japanese soldier could choose life over honor, then perhaps others could too. And if that was true, then the entire strategic calculation for the invasion of Japan based on the assumption that every man, woman, and child would fight to death might need revision. In the days following her capture, J-847F was questioned by Japanese-speaking intelligence officers, Nisei translators who themselves occupied a complex position in the American military hierarchy. The interrogations were gentle by the standards of the time: no physical coercion, no psychological pressure beyond the inherent stress of captivity. The questions focused on unit disposition, defensive preparations, morale. She answered some and declined others, not with defiance, but with a kind of wary selectivity, as though she had decided that some information was worth protecting, and some was not. What emerged From these interrogations was a picture of the Japanese defense in the Philippines that matched American intelligence assessments but added human detail. Supply lines had collapsed by November 1944. Air superiority was absolute. Any movement during daylight invited destruction from the sky. Disease and starvation killed more soldiers than combat. Units fragmented into small groups that moved through jungle paths, attempting to link with other fragments, slowly dissolving into individuals who simply tried to survive one more day. The grand strategy of defending the Philippines had collapsed into the grinding reality of men and women dying of dysentery in the jungle, while American forces methodically reduced every position that showed resistance. She had surrendered, she told the interrogators, because she was tired. Not tired in the sense of needing sleep, though she needed that too. Tired of pretending. Tired of the disguise that required constant vigilance. Tired of the war itself, the pointlessness of dying for a position that would be overrun anyway, for an empire that had already lost but refused to acknowledge defeat. Tired of being afraid, of being hungry, of watching people die for reasons that made sense only in the abstract language, of honor and sacrifice but disintegrated when applied to the actual experience of lying in mud while American artillery turned the jungle into splinters. The translators who conveyed these words struggled to capture their tone. In Japanese, she spoke with the blunt directness of someone who had passed beyond the elaborate hierarchies of politeness that structured normal communication. She used short sentences, simple words, the language of exhaustion. In English, the translations came out flat and declarative, losing the emotional subtext that her words carried. But the essential message was clear. She had chosen life because death had stopped making sense. The symbolism of food became, in the days following her capture, a recurring motif in the journals and letters of Americans who interacted with prisoner J-847F. She was given standard POW rations, canned beef, crackers, coffee, chocolate. The quantity was modest by American standards, generous by the standards of anyone who had been living on foraged roots and rice gone moldy in damaged supply dumps. She ate slowly, methodically, with the focus of someone for whom food had become a theoretical concept rather than daily reality. A sailor named Thomas Chen Anise from California, whose family remained interned at Manzana while he served in the Pacific, wrote in his diary about watching her eat a chocolate bar. She unwrapped it carefully, preserving the foil and paper. She broke it into pieces, and then she ate each piece with an expression that Chen struggled to describe. It wasn't pleasure, he wrote. It wasn't even relief. It was more like confusion, like she couldn't understand how something could taste sweet anymore. Like sweetness had become a language she used to speak, but had forgotten. This observation the chocolate bar consumed without joy became for Chen a kind of revelation. He had spent the war translating interrogations, processing prisoners, serving as a bridge between two cultures while belonging fully to neither. He had endured the contradiction of fighting for a country that had imprisoned his family because of their ancestry, had proven his loyalty through service, while that loyalty was questioned by the very fact of his service being necessary. And in watching this Japanese woman eat chocolate with the mechanical focus of someone performing a duty rather than enjoying a gift, he recognized something he had seen in mirrors. The face of someone trying to inhabit a category that fit him perfectly. Food in wartime becomes more than sustenance. It becomes symbol. For American servicemen in the Pacific, the relative abundance of their supply lines, however inadequate it might feel to them, represented the industrial capacity that was winning the war. Mail from home included care packages with candy, cookies, magazines. Ships carried ice cream machines. Pilots shot down over the Pacific carried survival packs with chocolate, gum, vitamins. Even in combat zones, American forces rarely faced actual starvation. They might eat cold rations, go without hot food for weeks, endure the monotony of preserved and processed meals. But they ate. Japanese forces, by contrast, experienced systematic starvation as a feature rather than a bug of their strategic situation. The merchant fleet that had carried supplies to distant garrisons was at the bottom of the Pacific, destroyed by submarines and aircraft. Island garrisons were expected to be self-sufficient, growing their own food, rationing ruthlessly. The fighting spirit that propaganda celebrated was supposed to overcome material deprivation. Hunger became a test of will, and starvation a form of purification. The result was units that dissolved not through combat defeats, but through the simple arithmetic of calories. A soldier who had not eaten properly for months could not march, could not fight, could eventually not even maintain the will to resist. Japanese positions in the Philippines were overrun as much by malnutrition as by firepower. Men died of beriberi, of dysentery, of infections that healthy bodies could fight but starving bodies could not. The defensive strategy relied on spirit overcoming material reality. And when spirit proved insufficient, there was no fallback position except death.so when prisoner J-847F was given American rations, given food in quantities that seemed impossible. Given chocolate and coffee and canned meat, the experience was not simply physical relief, but cognitive dissonance. Everything she had been taught about American moral degeneracy was contradicted by the simple fact of adequate food. The enemy that propaganda described as barely human, as effete and weak and lacking spiritual strength, had an abundance that made Japanese privation look like suicide by starvation. One of the Navy doctors noticed that she ate only half of her rations at first. When asked why, through an interpreter, she explained that she assumed the food would stop, that this abundance was temporary, and she needed to save half for later. The concept of continuous supply of there being more food tomorrow and the day after was alien to someone who had spent months calculating survival in terms of rice handfuls and foraged roots. Abundance was not something to trust. It was a trap, a temporary condition that would inevitably collapse into scarcity. It took days for her to understand that the food would keep coming. And in that understanding came another crack in the ideological certainty that had sustained her through years of war. If the Americans had enough food to feed their prisoners generously, what else had propaganda lied about? The question of what to do with her became a minor administrative puzzle that revealed larger institutional confusions. Prisoner of war protocols assumed male captives. The Geneva Convention, to which Japan was not a signatory, but which the United States generally observed, made provisions for captured combatants. But a female Japanese soldier occupied a category that challenged the neat distinctions between combatant and civilian, between prisoner of war and internee, initially. She was processed as a standard POW and designated for transfer to the main processing center on Leyte. But this plan was quickly revised when someone in the chain of command recognized the propaganda value of her capture. A Japanese woman soldier, particularly one who had surrendered voluntarily, was exactly the kind of evidence that could be used to undermine Japanese claims of national unity and fighting spirit. If women were being thrown into combat, it suggested desperation. If those women could surrender, it suggested that the facade of total commitment was cracking.so instead of immediate transfer. She was held aboard the USS Cascade for extended interrogation. Intelligence officers from various agencies interviewed her repeatedly, asking not just about military dispositions but about morale, about civilian attitudes, about the state of Japanese society as it prepared for the invasion everyone knew was coming. They asked about her family, a subject that caused her visible distress, and about her motivations for enlisting, and about what ordinary Japanese people believed about there was progress. Her answers were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, filtered through exhaustion and trauma and the simple difficulty of translating concepts that existed in complex relationship and cultural context. But certain themes emerged. She had volunteered, though the word volunteer carried implications in Japanese that differed from English because not volunteering would have marked her family as disloyal. She had believed initially that Japan would win, or at least not lose, because belief was easier than the alternative. She had stopped believing not in one dramatic moment, but through accumulated small realizations, the way supplies never came, the way officers spoke confidently about reinforcements that never arrived, the way strategic withdrawals were described as tactical, repositioning even as the perimeter shrank. She had disguised herself as male not because the military required it, women were technically allowed in auxiliary units, but because she understood instinctively that being recognized as female would limit her already limited agency. Male soldiers, however junior, had status. Female auxiliaries were support staff, not combatants, and when combat came, they were expected to commit suicide to avoid capture and rape. Binding her chest, cutting her hair, adopting masculine posture and speech patterns, these were survival strategies that predated the military situation. They were the tools of someone who had learned that safety came from invisibility. The Americans who interrogated her struggled to fit her story into categories they understood. Was she a victim of Japanese militarism, forced into service against her will? Or was she a true believer who had only lost faith when defeat became undeniable? Was her surrender an act of courage or cowardice? Was she sympathetic or threatening? The questions multiplied because her existence challenged the binary thinking that made war psychologically manageable. She was supposed to be enemy or innocent, combatant or civilian, but she was somehow both and neither. Lieutenant Commander Steinberg wrote in a personal letter to a colleague that she was the most troubling prisoner I have processed, not because of anything she's done or said, but because of what she represents. We've spent years telling ourselves that we're fighting an enemy that's fundamentally other, that sees death differently, that values life differently. And here is someone who surrendered because she was tired, not because she was disloyal or cowardly, but because she made a rational calculation that survival was preferable to death, which is exactly what we would expect from any rational person, which suggests that maybe the enemy isn't as other as we've needed to believe the tearing of the dress became. In retellings, a symbol that accumulated meanings beyond the simple facts of the event. Among the crew of the USS Cascade, stories circulated. Some versions emphasized the shock of discovery, the American soldiers who thought they had captured a man and found a woman. Other versions focused on Morrison's reaction, turning him into a character who represented American decency confronting Japanese deception. Still others transformed the incident into something darker, suggesting violence or impropriety that the actual records do not support. These variations reveal how narrative serves psychological needs. The men who fought in the Pacific needed stories that organized the chaos into meaning. They needed the enemy to be monstrous so that killing was justified, or pitiable so that victory felt like liberation rather than slaughter. They needed their own actions to be heroic, or at least necessary. And they needed women to remain in their traditional category, civilians to be protected, or wives and sisters waiting at home because women soldiers complicated the moral geometry of warfare. Prisoner J-847F disrupted all these needs. She was neither monstrous nor pitiable in the required ways. She had fought, so she was enemy combatant. But she had surrendered, so she was not fanatical. She was female, so she activated protective instincts. But she wore a uniform, so she was legitimate target. She existed in the uncomfortable space between categories, and stories about her became attempts to resolve that discomfort. For Morrison, the man who had torn the dress, the incident became a permanent marker in his personal chronology of the war. In letters home, he did not mention it directly, such details were censored, but he alluded to things that don't fit what they told us, and seeing someone who made me question after the war. In the scattered oral histories collected by local veterans organizations, he spoke more directly. I thought I knew who the enemy was, he said in a 1978 interview. And then I met someone who was supposed to be the enemy, and she was just tired and hungry and wanting to stop. And I realized that maybe we were all just tired and wanting to stop, but we couldn't, because the war had its own momentum and we were just caught in it. This realization that the enemy was not categorically different. The Japanese soldiers were humans responding to unbearable circumstances in human ways, did not make Morris a pacifist or led him to question whether the war itself was justified. He remained convinced, until his death in 1992, that defeating Japan was necessary and right. But it complicated his understanding of what victory meant and what costs it had exacted from everyone involved. The dress itself, torn and discarded, was incinerated as potentially contaminated material. Standard procedure for processing enemy equipment. It was not preserved, not studied, not kept as evidence or artifact. In its destruction, it became perfect symbol. The material facts erased, leaving only the stories, conflicting and contradictory, that people told to make sense of what they had witnessed. In the broader context of the Pacific War, Prisoner J-847F was a footnote, one person among millions, one surrender among thousands, one woman among the estimated 20,000 who served in various capacities with Japanese forces in the Philippines. Her individual story mattered only insofar as it was documented, and it was documented only because someone in the chain of command thought it might have propaganda value. That propaganda value was never fully exploited. Plans to use her in leaflet campaigns or radio broadcasts to show Japanese soldiers that surrender was possible, that America treated prisoners humanely, were discussed but never implemented. Partly this was because the war was moving too quickly. By the time bureaucracy had processed the possibility, Manila had fallen, and the focus had shifted to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the impending invasion of the home islands. Partly it was because using a female prisoner as propaganda raised questions about propriety and might backfire by seeming to mock Japanese culture. So she remained in custody. Transferred eventually to the main POW facility on Leyte, then to a camp in the Marianas, then finally to the processing center in Yokohama after Japan's surrender. At each stage, she was a curiosity, an anomaly in filing systems designed for male prisoners. At each stage, someone had to decide what category she belonged to, what protocols applied, whether she should be housed with male POWs or separated, whether her surrender marked her as traitor or victim. The records of her repatriation are fragmentary. She was released in late 1945 or early 1946. The exact date is unclear, and returned to a Japan that had been transformed beyond recognition. Cities burned, economy collapsed, occupation forces everywhere. The emperor's divinity renounced. She returned to a family that had believed her dead, because official notification of her capture had never been sent or had been lost in the chaos of defeat. She returned to a society that viewed POWs with suspicion and shame, that treated surrender as betrayal, even when rational minds acknowledged that continuing to fight had become impossible. What happened to her after repatriation is unknown. Japanese records of the period are incomplete, and the social stigma of having been captured meant that many former POWs changed names, moved to new areas, reconstructed identities that erased the shameful period of captivity. She vanishes from the historical record, becomes one more anonymous survivor in a nation of survivors, all of them trying to build new lives from the rubble of the old, but her story fragmentary, contested, preserved in scattered American documents, and the memories of men who processed her endures as a small window into the larger catastrophe. She represents the thousands of women who served, whose service was erased, because it contradicted the narrative of traditional femininity that Japanese and American cultures both preferred. She represents the soldiers who surrendered not because they were cowards, but because the will to die for abstract honor had been exhausted by concrete suffering. She represents the way that war, in its extremity, breaks down the categories we use to organize reality, forcing individuals into impossible positions where every choice violates some deeply held principle. The symbolic resonance of the torn dress extends beyond the immediate incident to illuminate larger truths about how societies sustain total war. Total war requires total commitment, which requires total belief. Belief that the cause is just. Belief that the enemy is other. Belief that sacrifice is meaningful rather than merely tragic. Propaganda, censorship, education, culture all are mobilized to maintain this belief structure, because without it the edifice of mass mobilization collapses. Japan's propaganda emphasized spiritual purity over material capacity. The West was decadent, individualistic, weak in spirit, despite its industrial strength. Japanese soldiers possessed Yamado Damashi, the spirit of Yamado, which would overcome American material advantages. Surrender was literally unthinkable, erased from the category of possible actions, because to acknowledge surrender as possibility would undermine the belief structure that made continued fighting possible. American propaganda emphasized the opposite. Material abundance as proof of cultural superiority. Democracy produced prosperity, which produced the tanks and planes and ships that were burying the Axis under weight of metal. American soldiers were not expected to die for their country, they were expected to make the enemy die for his. The ideology was pragmatic, materialist, focused on overwhelming force rather than spiritual transcendence. When these two systems collided in the form of prisoner J-847F, the contradictions became visible. She had believed in spiritual strength until starvation made belief impossible. She had internalized the prohibition on surrender until the actual choice was between capture and death, and capture looked like survival while death looked like pointless waste. She had crossed the line that propaganda said was uncrossable, and in crossing it revealed that the line was always imaginary, maintained only by the collective agreement not to look too closely at its arbitrary nature for the Americans who processed her. The revelation worked differently but was equally destabilizing. They had believed they were fighting an enemy that was fundamentally alien, that did not value life the way they did, that would fight to extinction rather than admit defeat. This belief justified the scale of violence required to win, the firebombing of cities, the submarine warfare that starved garrisons, the willingness to contemplate invasion casualties in the millions. If the enemy was truly other, truly willing to die to the last person, then only absolute destruction could bring peace. But a prisoner who surrendered because she was tired suggested that the enemy was not alien, but merely desperate. And if the enemy was desperate rather than fanatical, then perhaps the scale of violence being contemplated the invasion of Japan, the estimated American casualties of 500,000. The Japanese casualties that would dwarf that number was based on flawed assumptions. Perhaps there were of ramps from total war that did not require total destruction. History records that these questions, if asked at all in 1945, were not asked loudly enough or at high enough levels to change policy. The plans for invasion proceeded. The atomic bombs were dropped. Japan surrendered not because its people had lost the will to fight, though they had, but because the emperor, perceiving that continued resistance meant annihilation, made the choice that none of his subjects could make for themselves. Prisoner J to 847F, whoever she was, did not change the course of the war, but her existence, her surrender, her tears in the corridor of a repair ship anchored in Leyte Gulf. These things stand as evidence that behind the abstractions of strategy and the categories of propaganda, there were individuals making impossible choices in unbearable circumstances. Individuals who were not symbols but people. People who got tired. People who wanted to survive. People who, in the end, chose life even when their entire culture told them that death was the only honorable path. The epilogue to this story is written in absence. We do not know what happened to her. We do not know if she rebuilt a life, if she found peace, if the trauma of war and the shame of capture eventually faded into the background noise of survival. We know only that she existed, that for a brief moment she was visible in the historical record, and then she vanished back into the anonymity that shelters most lives from history's scrutiny. But the questions her existence raises do not vanish. They persist, uncomfortable and necessary. Questions about how we categorize enemies, how we justify violence, how we maintain the psychological structures that make mass killing possible. Questions about gender and war, about who is allowed to fight and who is expected to die, and whether those categories serve anything other than our need for simple narratives. Questions about surrender and survival, about honor and shame, about whether choosing life over death is courage or cowardice, or simply the most human response to inhuman circumstances. In the end, perhaps the most important question is not about her, but about us, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget, about whose stories get told and whose vanish into footnotes, about whether we can hold in our minds the truth that war is sometimes necessary and always tragic, that enemies are human even when they must be fought, that victory does not erase the cost paid by victor and vanquished alike. The torn dress, long since incinerated, remains not as material object, but as image, as symbol, as the moment when the careful boundaries between categories, male and female, enemy and person, soldier and victim dissolved in the face of someone who refused to fit neatly into the boxes we had prepared. In that moment of dissolution, however brief, however quickly covered over by new certainties and familiar categories, a truth appeared, that war is not fought between abstractions but between people, and that people, even in extremity, sometimes choose survival over sacrifice, life over honor, tomorrow over today. That choice quiet, unheroic, deeply human, echoes across the decades, echoes in the understanding that ideology is always fiction, that propaganda is always incomplete, that the enemy is never quite the monster we need him to be, echoes in the recognition that behind every uniform, every flag, every cause, there are individuals trying to survive circumstances they did not choose and cannot control, echoes in the hope, fragile and persistent, that someday we might find ways to solve our conflicts that do not require us to sort human beings into categories of us and them, worthy and unworthy, saved and damned. The woman who stood in that corridor in January 1945 was all of us. Was anyone who has ever faced impossible choices and chosen imperfectly. Was anyone who has ever worn a disguise to survive. Was anyone who has ever been caught between the demands of honor and the desire to simply live. She was Japanese and enemy and prisoner and woman and soldier and victim and person. All of these categories true and all of them inadequate. All of them ways we try to organize the chaos of reality into shapes we can understand, and in the end, she was someone who got tired. Someone who looked at the choice between death with honor and life with shame and chose life. Not because she was weak or disloyal or cowardly, but because she was human. And humans, when pushed far enough, when stripped of the comfortable illusions that peacetime allows, Sometimes recognize that survival is not betrayal, but affirmation. That living is not shame but hope. That there is meaning in tomorrow even when today has taken everything else. The dress was torn. The disguise was revealed. The categories collapsed. And for one brief moment, before the war continued and the machinery of death ground on toward its conclusion, someone saw not an enemy but a person, saw not propaganda but truth, saw not the other but the self, reflected in the eyes of someone who had simply had enough, that seeing, that recognition, that moment of shared humanity amid industrial scale inhumanity. That is what endures. That is what the torn dress means, decades after the fact. That is what prisoner J to 847F, whoever she was, represents. Not a footnote to history, but a reminder. A reminder that behind every statistic, every casualty figure, every triumph and tragedy of war, there are people. People who cry. People who get tired. People who, given the impossible choice between dying as heroes and living as survivors, sometimes choose to live, and in that choice, quiet and unglamorous and unheroic. There is more truth about war than in all the propaganda, all the speeches, all the monuments we build to celebrate victories and honor sacrifices. The truth that war is waste, that enemies are human, that survival is not betrayal, but the most honest thing we can do when faced with forces larger than ourselves. She tore nothing. The soldier tore the dress. But in that tearing, in that revelation, in that moment when deception was stripped away and human faced human across the unbridgeable gap of war, in that moment, something else tore too. Some membrane of certainty. Some comfortable illusion that the enemy was other and therefore easy to kill. Some necessary fiction that made mass death bearable by making it seem meaningful. What remained, after the tearing, was truth. Uncomfortable, inconvenient, unresolved. The truth that we are all just people, trying to survive, making impossible choices, and hoping that someday, somehow, the choosing will end, and we can simply live. Simply be. Simply exist without the weight of flags and causes and honor and shame and all the other abstractions that turn survival into betrayal and life into cowardice. The torn dress, the silent tears, the choice to live. These are not metaphors. They are facts. Facts that history has mostly forgotten, but that persist in the scattered documents and fading memories of those who were there. Facts that remind us, if we let them, that war is not the grand narrative of nations but the small tragedies of individuals. That victory is not clean and defeat is not simple and survival is not shameful. That we are all, every one of us, capable of being the woman in the corridor, tired, hungry, afraid, trying to survive, choosing life over honor because life, however diminished, is all we have. And that choice, unglamorous and unheroic, is perhaps the most human thing there is. The war ended. She survived. And somewhere in the ruins of post-war Japan, she built a life whose details we will never know. Built it from shame and memory and the stubborn insistence on continuing. Built it because the alternative was surrender of a different kind. Built it because humans, even after everything, choose to go on. That continuation, that stubborn survival, that is the true epilogue. Not the military victories or strategic turning points or diplomatic triumphs, but the individual decisions made in obscurity, to live another day, to eat another meal, to wake up another morning and face the weight of memory and shame and trauma and still choose to continue. The dress was torn on January 17, 1945. The war ended on August 15, 1945. But the survival continues still, written in the lives of all those who carried the weight of war forward into peace, who rebuilt from ruins, who chose life even when life seemed like betrayal. In that choice, repeated across millions of individuals, lies the only redemption war allows. Not that it happened, not that it was necessary, but that it ended, that people survived, that life continued, that the torn dress, the silent tears, the exhausted surrender, that these became not endings but beginnings. Beginnings of the long work of surviving, of healing, of finding ways to live with what was done and what was lost. That work continues. For all of us. Because we all inherit the choices made in corridors of warships, in jungles where people starved, in moments when the categories collapsed and human faced human across the unbridgeable gap. We inherit the obligation to remember not the comfortable versions but the uncomfortable truths, to see not the propaganda but the people, to recognize that the enemy was never quite what we needed them to be, and that our own righteousness was never quite as clean as we pretended. The woman who stood in that corridor, whose name we do not know, whose face we cannot see, whose fate we can only guess, she stands for all of them, all the unnamed, all the forgotten, all who made impossible choices and survived into peace that brought its own burdens. She stands as reminder that war is not won by nations but endured by people, that honor is not found in death but in the stubborn refusal to die, that survival, however shameful, is the victory that matters most. Her dress was torn. She chose to live, and in that choice, simple and profound, the war revealed its deepest truth, that life, even diminished, even shameful, even purchased at the cost of every certainty we hold dear, life is still worth choosing, still worth fighting for, not with weapons but with the quiet courage of continuing, still worth the burden of memory, the weight of survival, the long aftermath of trauma. She lived. We do not know how or for how long, but she lived, and that life, however obscure, stands as testament to the resilience of humans to survive what should destroy them, to carry forward what should break them, to choose tomorrow when honor and ideology and every abstract principle says today should be the end. That choice echoes still in every survivor, in every person who has faced impossible circumstances and chosen imperfectly, in everyone who carries the weight of history forward and refuses, stubbornly, to be crushed by it. The torn dress, the silent hairs, the decision to live, these are not relics of the past but living truths, repeated in different forms, different contexts, different wars and different pieces. The truth that we endure, that we continue, that we survive not because we are strong, but because we must, because the alternative is unthinkable, even when thinking it is all we do. And so the story ends where it began, in a corridor, on a ship, in the aftermath of violence. A dress torn, a deception revealed, a human seen finally as human. The war would continue for months more. Thousands more would die. Cities would burn. Armies would clash. The machinery of death would grind on toward its conclusion. But in that moment, however brief, the categories failed. The propaganda dissolved. And what remained was simply two people, captor and captive, American and Japanese, man and woman, looking at each other across the unbridgeable gap and recognizing, however imperfectly, the common humanity that war had tried so hard to erase. That recognition changed nothing. The war continued, but it changed everything. Because once seen, it could not be unseen. Once acknowledged, it could not be denied. The enemy was human. The other was self. And the choice between dying with honor and living with shame was not the moral absolute that propaganda claimed, but simply a choice, one that people made based on circumstance, exhaustion, the particular calculus of that particular moment. She made her choice. He tore the dress. The truth was revealed. And decades later, in the documents and memories and scattered traces left behind, we can still see the outline of that moment, still feel its weight, still recognize in it something essential about war and peace, about enemies and humans, about the categories we construct and the truths that demolish them. The dress was torn, and in that tearing, so were all the comfortable certainties that made war bearable. What remained was truth, naked and unadorned. The truth that war is waste, that survival is victory, that life, however diminished, is always worth choosing, and that we are all, every one of us, just people trying to survive circumstances we cannot control, making impossible choices, and hoping, always hoping, that tomorrow will be better than today, that the choosing will end, that peace, real peace, will finally come. It came. The war ended. She survived. And in that survival, quiet and unheroic and stubbornly human, lies the only redemption possible. Not that war was necessary or just or meaningful, but that it ended, that people lived, that the torn dress became memory, and memory became history, and history became the stories we tell to remind ourselves why it must never happen again. But it will happen again. It always does. Because we forget. Because the categories are so comfortable and the propaganda so compelling, and the alternative acknowledging the full humanity of the enemy requires a courage that peace makes easy, but war makes almost impossible. Almost, but not quite. Because sometimes, in corridors of warships, in moments of exhaustion and revelation, the categories fail. The enemy becomes person, and we see briefly the truth we spend so much effort avoiding, that we are all the same, all human, all trying to survive, all worthy of life, however imperfectly we live it, that seeing is the gift and the burden, The gift because it is truth, the burden because truth obligates us to remember, to acknowledge, to carry forward the weight of what was done and what was lost, to honor not the heroes but the survivors, not the victories but the endurance, not the certainties but the doubts, the questions, the uncomfortable recognitions that resist easy categorization. The woman in the corridor carried this burden, carried it into a peace that offered no welcome, into a society that saw her survival as shame, into decades of silence and anonymity, carried it because there was no choice, because survival meant carrying whatever weight it brought. And in that carrying, quiet and unglamorous and hidden from history's spotlight, she completed the work that warriors cannot do, the work of living with war, of surviving it, of building life from the ruins it creates. That work is not finished. It never is. Because was legacy is not just the dead but the living, not just the destroyed but the rebuilt, not just the moment of violence but the decades of aftermath. The torn dress becomes symbol not just of that moment in January 1945, but of all the moments when categories fail and truth intrudes and humans recognize each other across unbridgeable gaps. Becomes reminder that the work is always to see, to acknowledge, to recognize our shared humanity, even especially when everything tells us the enemy is other. She was not other. She was ours. And in that recognition lies the beginning of wisdom. That war is our shared failure. That peace is our shared obligation. That survival is our shared victory. That the categories are lies we tell ourselves. And the truth is always human. Tired, hungry, afraid, and choosing, against all reason and honor and ideology, to live. The dress was torn. The truth was revealed. And the war eventually ended. But the work of surviving continues, written in lives we will never know, carried by people we will never meet, repeated in every generation that must learn again the lessons their grandparents forgot. That war is waste. That enemies are human. That life is worth choosing. That survival, however shameful, is the victory that matters most. And in that survival, stubborn, imperfect, profoundly human, lies the only hope we have, that someday we might learn to see each other clearly enough, often enough, that the categories dissolve before the shooting starts, that the propaganda fails before the dying begins, that we recognize in time that the person standing before us, however different, however other, however easy to hate, is someone who gets tired, who wants to live, who would choose survival over sacrifice if given the chance. That person was her. That person is us. And until we learn to see it, to acknowledge it, to build our peace on that recognition rather than on the comfortable lies of our differences, until then, the dress will keep tearing, the truth will keep emerging, and we will keep facing, in corridors and battlefields and moments of exhausted revelation, the same uncomfortable recognition that we are all just human, trying to survive.